Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Tiresmoke podcast. My name is Will O'Mara, and today we're going to be talking about a very, very special aircraft. This was the first ever supersonic transport, the Tupolev 144. This also has the unfortunate distinction of being the worst supersonic transport aircraft, but we're going to get into why right now. So to explain what a supersonic transport aircraft is, a supersonic aircraft transport is a plane that can carry passengers above the speed of sound. The speed of sound equals 267.269 miles an hour. So that's pretty fast. The reason why you'd want to go over the speed of sound is because it allows planes to go faster. Going faster is important because it allows passengers to get to the places they need to go quicker. In the late 40s and early 50s, you're starting to see the first aircraft going over the speed of sound. These are primarily prototypes, like the Bell X-1 that Chuck Yeager flew, who broke the speed of sound. So these aircraft become more and more fast. People are starting to look at commercial uses for them instead of just military uses. A supersonic transport aircraft would allow planes to carry more passengers over a set amount of time, thus higher revenue for companies flying these planes. The Soviets wanted in on this, and so they commissioned a program to build a supersonic aircraft. Originally, they were given the projects that they were given had these engines called the NK-135, and that project was given on September 19th, 1962 to Tupolev. However, that project fell apart after a little more than a month and was terminated before you even had Halloween. Later, in 1963, in July, the Soviets ordered Tupolev to build a four-engined supersonic transport to be titled the Tu-144. Now, the engines were soon determined through a committee council called the State Committee on Aeronautical Technology, with a rather amusing abbreviation, but I'm too mature to talk about it. The requirements were approved by September 1964, and in 1965, in June, the first model of the plane would appear. This is the image that is going to show up in this podcast, the only image I'll have. Now, this plane looked kind of weird. If you're familiar with the Concorde, the general shape of it looks familiar. It's very thin, dart-like. It's got the delta wings, which are just the triangles, and it's got a long tail. But it's got these two, like a droopy elephant ears at the side. Those are called canards, and those are supposed to help it take off and land, because it creates something called lift, which allows it to take off and land in a lesser amount of area. The thing is with these supersonic transports is that they take a lot of room to get off the ground. And the Soviet Union, which didn't have too many long runways, they had a lot of medium runways, but they had only a few long runways. They wanted the Tu-144 to be able to take off in most places, so they added these canards. They were very important, but they just made the aircraft look awful. So they start to design this prototype, and they're testing out all of the new mechanics, and there's a lot of new mechanics here, which are very similar to the Concorde. A lot of people thought this was a ripoff of the Concorde, but I disagree. It actually, in some areas, was superior to the Concorde, because the Concorde could only go 1,000 565.229 miles an hour. The Soviet Concorde thing, the Tu-144, also nicknamed the Konkordsky, could fly 1,649 miles an hour. So it could fly nearly 100 miles an hour faster than the Concorde. It was a very fast aircraft. But it also had a lot of technologies that weren't very well designed. The Concorde was more refined. It had much better design details. It was made by better engineers. It had a lot of strange features as well. It had a braking parachute, which you might have seen like footage of like a space shuttle landing and a parachute comes out of the back. But this had that, and it was one of the last commercial aircrafts with one of those parachutes. It also had ejection seats for the crew. So this is the only passenger jet I know of that had ejection seats ever installed in it. But I believe that was only on the prototype. The engines were originally the NK-144 turbofans from Kuznetsov design. However, these engines were really unreliable. They kept breaking most of the time, and they didn't make enough power. They were forced to use afterburners, as seen on like carrier aircraft, to get them to go the speed they needed. So they replaced those engines on later models of the Tu-144 with Koloselov RD-3651 turbojets, which were quite better. Now, the Tu-144 took a lot of time to design. I mentioned how it was approved in the mid-1960s, but there are built over the 60s. In 1968, it does make its first proper flight. The last day of 1968, too, they were cutting it real close. The 31st of December, 1968, it flies from Zhukovsky Airfield all the way 37 minutes out, and then returns back. So they didn't really go too far, but it was to be tested. And the importance of it was that it was the first supersonic aircraft to leave the ground, because Concorde was still on the ground. In fact, it only left on the 2nd of March in 1969. So the Tu-144 kept being demonstrated over this period, and it looked like the Soviets had made it work. However, there were a lot of problems with the design. I'll get into these problems soon. When they flew around, they were not really used that well. In fact, I told you about how long it was taking for it to be designed. This thing, which was approved in 1963 to be built, had its first service flight the day after Christmas, 1975. It took a real long time. All it did was fly mail and freight until November 1977, which was when it was actually allowed to carry passenger aircraft. It ended up only flying 55 passenger flights, which is abysmal. Like, JetBlue flies 55 flights in 12 hours, and this flew 55 flights throughout its entire career for passengers. In fact, its 55 passenger flight ended in 1978. So this only really lasted in passenger service for less than a year. And we're going to see why in a few seconds. This thing was really unreliable. During 102 flights total and 181 hours of flight time in total, there were more than 226 failures in the plane, 80 of them in flight. So that is pretty abysmal. That's like more than one failure an hour, which you shouldn't have happening while you're flying. Most of the flights ended up being canceled because there were issues such as the cabin decompressing in mid-flight, which is not fun, and overheating plane, which causes the engines to break, which is also not good. The designer of the plane, Alexei Tupolev, and two vice ministers of the USSR had to be personally present at Domodedovo Airport before each scheduled flight to make sure that the aircraft was safe and to decide if it could be released into flight. Most of the Tu-144s ended up being stuck at Domodedovo, which, by the way, is in Moscow. Pilot Alexander Larin remembers especially this troublesome flight around the 25th of January 1978. So not too long after it entered passenger service, 22 of 24 onboard systems failed. 7 to 8 systems were failing before takeoff. There was a large number of foreign TV and radio journalists and other foreign dignitaries on the flight. So it was decided that to avoid the political embarrassment of canceling, they would just take off with this broken plane. And the plane was the problem is that while it was en route supersonic at Mach 2, which is 1,400 miles an hour, it was the Tupolev Bureau's Crisis Center predicted that the front and left landing gear would not extend and that the aircraft would have to land on the right wing gear alone at a landing speed of 190 miles an hour. So, due to the expected fallout from that, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev was personally notified on what was going on. There was a siren that went off in the plane that sounded like a civil defense warning, something you'd hear if you were going to get bombed. The crew couldn't find a way to switch it off, so the passengers got to listen to this siren for 75 minutes, which, if you're on a plane that's braking, hearing a siren for over an hour is probably not something that would make you feel calm. The captain ended up ordering the navigator to borrow a pillow from the passengers and stuff it inside the siren's horn to shut it up. And after all the suspense, Tupolev was wrong because all of the landing gear was extended and the aircraft landed safely. There was only one route anyways, so it didn't really matter. The only place you could fly it to was between Moscow and this place called Alma-Ata, or now known as Almaty. There were only 8 certified aircraft available, and so that kind of suggests that the Soviets didn't really have confidence in this plane, which, to be fair, considering the fact that it kept breaking mid-flight, that makes sense. There's only 70 or 80 passengers, and the Tupolev could carry like 120 some, so there's quite a lot of empty seats. And even then, there's like an average of 58 passengers per flight because someone did the math. Well, I did the math because there were a total of 3,194 passengers over 55 scheduled flights. So 58 passengers per flight. So officials were pretty aware that this thing was unreliable and wasn't going to work. and was a bad idea in general, they decided that they were going to, as they mentioned, they limited people from going on this. And who would want to go on a plane that's constantly breaking either? So they minimized passenger load to limit the impact and political fallout of a crash, which they were expecting to happen. There were also severe airframe problems. There was the airframe, just like the frame of the aircraft, wasn't built well enough. It kept cracking. And when your crack starts to develop, it quickly spreads over many feet, and there's no way to stop it without just like fixing the airframe entirely. So if you're at like some foreign airport, it's not good. These things kept breaking down all the time. In fact, Tupolev had to go to British Aerospace Corporation and Aerospatial, the people who built the Concorde, for advice in how to fix the air intakes that kept breaking. And it was just like, imagine like being the Soviets and having to go to like a Western pig dog imperialist nation and ask for help because your glorious new anti-capitalist supersonic jet aircraft is broken all the time. And these bourgeois capitalists are the only people that can fix it because they know how to design aircraft. That's pretty embarrassing. Also, you wouldn't want to fly on it, not just because it was unreliable, it kept breaking, and you'd probably have a heart attack from fear of dying. It also had really loud cabin noise. There's 95 decibels, which is really loud, because the engine had the afterburners, as I mentioned, and it was so noisy. People had to just pass around handwritten notes to figure it out. Alexei Tupolev acknowledged the problem to foreign passengers, and he said, "Yeah, I'm going to fix it," and he never fixed it. But it didn't matter because no one would really want to fly it. Oh yeah, I want to mention now the because I think I've gone so far in talking about how bad the plane is. I have to mention its worst moment, and it was the 1973 Paris Air Show. So, the Paris Air Show it still exists, but the Paris Air Show exists to like show off. Plane companies go and bring their new plane and they fly them around and it shows off to all the people there. In 1973, the BAC Aerospatial Concorde was present, so the Soviets had to bring along the Tu-144 to compete with it. So the Concorde was flying around working and doing well. And so what the Soviets wanted to do, they flew the plane to do this loop-the-loop thing. And it flew straight up in the air, kind of did a barrel roll, and it ended up making a very violent downwards maneuver. And as the plane tried to pull apart, the G-force snapped the plane in half. The Tu-144 crashed, destroying 15 houses. All 6 people on board the aircraft were killed. 8 more people on the ground lost their lives. A popular Soviet theory that came about was that the Tu-144 wasn't trying to do some risky move. It was trying to avoid a French Mirage jet fighter that was attempting to photograph the canards on the side. The French never really admitted the existence of the Mirage. Apparently the mirage did exist, but it's still debatable if that was caused by poor pilotry or the mirage being present. It's debatable if how the crash happened. And this thing at the Paris Air Show was a disaster. To have your star supersonic transport crash and burn in front of everyone just shows how miserable the project was. The Soviets ended up putting it out of service in the 80s after using it for a couple more mail and cargo missions. It has not been flown ever since. It still exists around. There's quite a few of them left of the 14 they built. Most of them are just museum pieces now. I think there's a museum down in Germany that has both the Concorde and the Tu-144 displayed next to each other, which is pretty cool. You get to compare those aircraft visually because they're very similar. The last thing that the Tu-144 did in its life was quite surprising. It flew for NASA. Now, let me explain how this happened. NASA purchased this Tu-144 for this high-speed commercial research program because the U.S. was interested in developing their own supersonic transport at this time. So this aircraft was sent to the U.S. and modified at the cost of $350 million. It was designated the Tu-144 Latayush Laboratoria, which stands for Flying Laboratory. The aircraft flew 27 times in Russia during the 1996 and 1997. It was a technical success. The U.S. learned a lot from it, but the project was canceled in 1999 because the U.S. wasn't interested in funding it more. That aircraft was sold in 2001 on an online auction for $11 million. Imagine that, just going on eBay or whatever the eBay was in 2001 and just finding this NASA modified Soviet junk supersonic aircraft. They weren't actually allowed to buy. You weren't actually allowed to buy it because the Russian government didn't want it sold because the modifications that NASA did put Kuznetsov NK-321 engines from a Tupolev Tu-116 bomber, and that's military hardware. And since the Tu-160 is still in Russian service, the Russians didn't want their bomber engines to be sold to the other governments. So the last aircrafts have been left behind as museum pieces or as gate guards or whatever to sit around on pedestals where you can see them. And so that ends a sordid career for a interesting aircraft. I'm sorry I didn't tell you much about the design of it because a lot of its engineering is similar to the Concorde, and I'm planning on making a long series about the Concorde where I talk about all of the engineering stuff, and I don't want to have to repeat myself. But this is my little interim update after 2 years of radio silence. I wanted to make this just as something special. I wanted to do the Tu-144 because, as I mentioned, I'm planning on a Concorde thing, and I wanted to get this out into the public before I do that because these two aircraft are pretty similar, and the Tu-144 was such a catastrophic, abysmal, shambolic display and it kind of was a laughing stock on Tupolev. But it's a pretty good aircraft designer. I'd say some of their aircraft designs are quite good. They just made this absolute lemon. It's kind of like the Ford Pinto of aircraft, except it didn't actually explode into flight. It just broke apart. Well, anyways, I do want to say something before I go. Trevor Gelsinger, thank you very much. This is coming out on your birthday, and I just wanted to say happy birthday to you. This is my birthday gift for you. Anyways, this is Will O'Mara signing off. I will see you next time. Goodbye.